In the early years of World War II, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. Hitler's armies had blitzed through Europe with devastating speed, capturing vast swaths of territory from France to the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, aimed at conquering the Soviet Union. By the fall of that year, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow, and many believed the Soviet Union would soon collapse under the weight of the Nazi war machine. However, the bitter Russian winter and fierce Soviet resistance halted the German advance. Faced with the failure to capture Moscow, Hitler shifted his focus southward in 1942, aiming to seize the industrial cities along the Volga River, including Stalingrad. The city's name, a direct reference to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, made it a symbolic prize. Hitler believed that taking Stalingrad would not only cripple Soviet morale, but also cut off vital Soviet supply routes from the south. The oil fields of the Caucasus were also a primary target, as they would fuel Germany's war efforts and deprive the Soviets of critical resources. As German forces marched towards Stalingrad, the Soviets scrambled to prepare their defenses. The Volga River became a lifeline for Soviet supplies, and the city's residents were mobilized to build fortifications. Soldiers and civilians alike knew that Stalingrad was more than just a city. It was the key to halting the German advance into the heart of the Soviet Union. What began as another battle in Hitler's Eastern Front campaign would soon escalate into one of the bloodiest and most decisive engagements of the war. Hitler saw the capture of Stalingrad as the key to controlling the Soviet Union's southern regions. Its industrial base, producing weapons and machinery for the Soviet war effort, made it a target of great strategic importance. As the Germans advanced, the Luftwaffe launched relentless bombing raids, reducing Stalingrad to smoldering ruins. Factories, homes, and infrastructure were obliterated, transforming the city into a deadly maze of rubble. But the destruction became a double-edged sword. The Soviet defenders, led by General Vasily Chuikov, used the ruins to their advantage, hiding in the wreckage and ambushing German troops in brutal streets. The battle wasn't just a fight for territory, it became a clash of wills. Stalin famously ordered that the city must be defended at all costs, and the Soviet soldiers, along with civilians, were inspired by a fierce determination to protect their homeland. For the Germans, taking Stalingrad became an obsession, and the battle would soon spiral into one of the deadliest and most decisive conflicts of the war. Backed by the powerful Luftwaffe, the Germans bombarded the city day and night, reducing much of it to ruins. Factories were destroyed, and thousands of civilians perished in the relentless bombing. Despite these heavy losses, Soviet forces under General Chuikov were not ready to surrender. They dug in, using the city's wreckage to their advantage. For the Germans, Stalingrad quickly turned into a nightmare. Tanks and vehicles found it impossible to navigate the rubble-strewn streets, and every building became a potential Soviet stronghold. Snipers hid in the ruins, picking off German soldiers one by one. By October, much of the city was under German control, but the Soviets still held key positions along the Volga River. Supplies and reinforcements trickled in under cover of darkness, ensuring the Soviets could continue their resistance. The Germans had expected a swift victory, but instead found themselves mired in a deadly war of attrition. The initial German advance was swift and brutal, with large portions of Stalingrad quickly falling under their control. The Luftwaffe conducted dozens of airstrikes, not only on military targets, but also on civilian infrastructure. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed or forced into hiding as factories, homes, and key supply routes were destroyed. The Germans, confident of a quick victory, believed that Stalingrad's fall was inevitable. Chuikov understood that the Germans were accustomed to rapid victories in open fields, but the ruins of Stalingrad offered the Soviets an advantage. Every street, every building, and every pile of debris became a potential stronghold. Soviet forces set up ambushes and traps, turning the urban landscape into a deadly maze. One of the most notable aspects of the Soviet defense was the involvement of ordinary citizens. Factories in the city continued to operate despite the constant bombardment. Workers, many of them women, manufactured weapons and even tanks, often under the direct fire of German forces. The Stalingrad tractor factory, once a producer of agricultural machinery, was converted to assemble T-34 tanks that were sent directly into battle from the factory floor. The defenders of Stalingrad, both soldiers and civilians, exemplified resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The Soviets also used sniper warfare to great effect. Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper, became a symbol of Soviet resistance, credited with killing over 225 German soldiers during the battle. His actions, along with those of other snipers, spread fear among the German ranks, forcing them to move cautiously through the ruined streets. The Soviets may have been outnumbered and outgunned, but their knowledge of the terrain and determination to protect their homeland made them a formidable force. By mid-November 1942, the situation for the Soviets seemed dire. The Germans controlled most of Stalingrad, and the Soviets were holding on by a thread along the banks of the Volga River. But while the Germans believed they were close to victory, Soviet High Command was planning a counter-offensive that would change the course of the battle, and indeed the entire war. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. This counterattack targeted the weaker flanks of the German 6th Army, which were held by Romanian and Hungarian forces. The Soviets, using a two-pronged assault, quickly broke through the Axis lines and encircled the German 6th Army, trapping them inside the city. The once mighty German forces were now cut off from reinforcements and supplies, surrounded by the Soviet Red Army. The cold Russian winter began to take its toll on the Germans, as hunger, disease, and the freezing temperatures further weakened their resolve. The Germans, under orders from Hitler, were forbidden to retreat. Despite the desperate conditions, General Paulus and his men were told to fight to the last man. But as the Soviet noose tightened, it became clear that survival was no longer possible. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now on the verge of total collapse. By late January 1943, the once mighty German Sixth Army was on the brink of total collapse. Surrounded, cut off from supplies, and facing brutal winter conditions, the soldiers were freezing, starving, and dying from disease. What had begun as a bold offensive to capture Stalingrad had turned into a nightmare. Soviet forces, strengthened by fresh reinforcements, relentlessly tightened their grip on the encircled Germans. Despite the hopeless situation, Hitler remained adamant that there would be no surrender. General Friedrich Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal in a last-ditch attempt to motivate him, was ordered to fight to the death. But by January 31, 1943, Paulus defied these orders and surrendered to the Soviets. Out of the 91,000 German soldiers taken as prisoners of war, only a fraction would survive the harsh conditions of Soviet captivity. It was a humiliating defeat for the Nazis, and the loss of Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. As Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the ruins of Stalingrad, the magnitude of their victory began to sink in. The battle had lasted over 5 months and claimed the lives of nearly 2 million people, including civilians. The German defeat shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and shifted the momentum of the war decisively in favor of the Allies. Stalingrad would forever be remembered as the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles in history. With over 2 million casualties, including soldiers and civilians, it was a brutal reminder of the human cost of war. The victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. From this point forward, the German forces would be on the defensive, retreating steadily across the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was a symbol of resilience and determination. The battle galvanized the Red Army and bolstered Soviet morale, proving that they could stand up to the seemingly unstoppable Nazi war machine. It was a turning point not only for the Eastern Front, but for the entire war. In the years that followed, Soviet forces would push the Germans out of Eastern Europe, eventually culminating in the fall of Berlin in 1945. The ruins of Stalingrad stood as a grim testament to the horrors of war. In the years after the battle, the city was rebuilt, and its name was changed to Volgograd. Monuments like the towering Motherland Calls statue at Mamayev Kurgan now stand as reminders of the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers and civilians who defended the city. Stalingrad will forever be remembered as a turning point in history. where the tide of war shifted and the fate of millions was decided. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Allies were preparing their own decisive action to turn the war further in their favor. In June 1944, Operation Overlord, commonly known as D-Day, would see Allied forces land on the beaches of Normandy, opening a second front against Nazi Germany. This invasion would not only relieve pressure on Soviet forces, but also bring the Allies closer to liberating Europe from Nazi occupation. The victory at Stalingrad had set the stage for this critical turning point, demonstrating the power of resilience and cooperation among the Allied nations. This Soviet victory had significant effects beyond the Eastern Front. As Hitler's forces grew increasingly strained, the Allies recognized the critical importance of opening a second front in the West. Preparations began in earnest for an invasion that would complement the Soviet efforts, creating a two-front assault to overwhelm the Axis powers. The Allied High Command, led by figures such as General Dwight D. Eisenhower, meticulously planned Operation Overlord, later known as D-Day. Their objective: to land in Normandy and begin the liberation of occupied Europe, accelerating the final defeat of Nazi Germany. As Soviet forces pressed from the east, Allied troops pushed through France, putting the Nazis on a path to inevitable defeat. The victory at Stalingrad had not only shifted the tide of war, but had also unified Allied efforts across continents. The end of the war now seemed possible, with the defenders of Stalingrad lighting the way for those who would fight for liberation on the beaches of Normandy. Check our next episode to learn about the D-Day of the World War II. Also, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.